Musical note, music. I also want to give a quick shout out to Punch Perfect Boxing, his breakdowns are always top notch. He's truly a master when it comes to analyzing those. And we are live. How's it going, everyone? Welcome back to the Punch Perfect Boxing channel. Today I'm going to be doing my Punch Perfect preview and predictions for the last crescendo card this Saturday in Saudi Arabia as part of Riyadh season. We've got 7 top fights to talk about and I'm going to go through them one by one. I did debate on the order of this video whether I would do it the main event down to the opener or whether I do the opener up through to the main event, but I thought it would make for more compelling listening if I was to go through these fights kind of one by one. But in terms of my degree of confidence on picking a winner in them, so starting with the F that I'm most confident in picking a winner in, and we'll eventually finish the video on the fact that I'm least confident in picking a winner, and so I think that will make for more competing this and hopefully so I'm going to do the video in that format today. So there'll be some fights in the middle of this video, this podcast, or whatever you want to call it, where I'm kind of not necessarily not confident in picking a winner, but I think there's kind of more room for interpretation. I think there could be more things at play, there could be more things that happen in those fights, so I'll save them for the middle and we'll start off with the fights that I'm most confident in picking a winner, and let me know your thoughts in the comments section below. I'm interested to know your guys' predictions for all 7 of these fights, to make sure to leave your thoughts below. But we'll get into the podcast today and I'll start off with the fight that I'm most confident in picking a winner in, and it should be no surprise to anyone, and I'm sure it's the same for everyone watching this video, but Shakur Stevenson versus Josh Padley. Now it's a good job other side to record this on the Wednesday, because had I done it earlier in the week or even last week, it would have been a wasted recording, because the fight was originally supposed to be Shakur Stevenson versus Floyd Schofield. Now that fight last night was pulled and it's Josh Padley that's now got the opportunity. A fair play to Josh Padley for stepping up, really happy for him. He's actually a relative of someone that subscribes to the channel, subscribes to my Patreon, is a really good guy, Sean, so obviously going to be rooting for Josh, of course one of my favorite fighters, and we know that Josh is in deep in this fight, but it's a great opportunity for him. He had a great opportunity back in September against Mark Chamberlain, and boy did he seize that opportunity, and it's kind of one of those where you're wondering, does he then get a rematch, get beat in a rematch, and then you never hear from him again? Is it one of those where he gets more big opportunities off the back of it? You know how will it play out for Josh? But he's now on a couple of days' notice, got the flight to go over to Saudi Arabia and is going to get paid a lot of money to be
really looking forward to it. I wanted to share my thoughts, wanted to speak about both fighters. And I think first and foremost, it's a really important fight for both men and to enhance their careers. For Nishida, it seems a bit more apparent that this would enhance his career and take him to another level, because he's just simply less recognised on the world stage than Junto. He's not mentioned as a future opponent for Inoue and for that Japanese super fight. You know, it's Nakatani that's recognised as that. Nishida is viewed as a world-level fighter, but Nakatani is viewed as a top 10 pound-for-pound talent. And there's been a lot of multi-weight world champions that we don't really think about anymore as top fighters, because they just always, pick the easiest belt on their kind of way through. And I'm not saying that's what Junto's done, but I think he's at the point now where he needs to start adding more silverware and better wins to the resume, more silverware, more signature wins, and that's what's really going to elevate him. I think a lot of people look at that Inoue super fight and think that's the winning that is what elevates him. He can do a hell of a lot more before that fight to elevate his career. So we'll get into the fight and we'll talk about both of them. I'm going to start off by talking about Nishida, because I really don't want you guys to underrate Nishida. I think he's absolutely fantastic. Wonderful fighter that I feel is really underrated, and when he stepped up, he's proven how good he is. Now, you'll notice under notable wins on screen, there aren't many, but in 10 fights, he's got 3 really solid victories. And I think the other thing that maybe jumps out when you look at his record is that there's only 10 wins there, 10 fights, and only 2 knockouts. But I think there's explanation to that, and we'll get into it as I talk through each of those 3 notable wins. So the first win, in his 3rd pro fight, he beat the very experienced Japanese champion, Shohei Omori. Again, you may look at that name and go, who is he? But he was a very experienced champion and a good Japanese domestic fighter. And Nishida, in his 3rd pro fight, beat him. It's the equivalent in the UK of, a British prospect that maybe we don't know a great deal about, but is coming through and gets in against a British champion who's had a ton of fights and experience, has won at that domestic level, and getting in there and winning and making it look good. And Nishida did that against Omori. And then in his 4th pro fight, this is the win that really stands out for me as a prospect. He beat Daigo Higa and he dominated him over the distance. Now, At that point, I think Higa probably took Nishida a little bit lightly as the underdog, and because his record, Higa had been a world champion and Nishida was just an unbeaten prospect who was relatively unproven. He kind of thought, I'm just going to win this fight, and Nishida was a big underdog with the bookies and stuff. But if you look at the way Nishida just dealt with him with ease, at the time you would say it's impressive, but it's one of the best wins in boxing, like in terms of how well it's aged. Higa has since gone in against world champions at bantamweight and given them hell. Seiya Satsumi, who's now the WBA champion in recess, but you probably still recognize him as the WBA champion, at least at the time when Higa fought him for a second time. That fight was really, really competitive. Satsumi, was in all sorts of trouble in that fight. Yoshiki Takai's coming off a brilliant win, top undefeated fighter. Daigo Higa, again, gave him all sorts of problems. And I think Higa was probably more up for those fights than he was for Nishida. But nonetheless, Nishida made it look easy. And two world-class, world champions at bantamweight didn't. So that win has aged fantastically well. And to do that in just his fourth pro fight is really special. It's something that we see, top Cuban amateurs and, top Ukrainian amateurs do when they turn over and they pick up these victories early in their career, and we go, wow, that's amazing. Nishida, it shouldn't be downplayed how impressive that win was in just his fourth pro fight. Now, the third and final notable win that we're going to talk about, because between Higa and the Manny Rodriguez fight, it was kind of a period of just improving his IBF ranking. There wasn't really a lot there for you to kind of dig into and sort of sink your teeth into. I think the fact that the opposition wasn't incredible meant that Nishida was kind of going through the motions and not really risking his position at the time. And he was kind of comfortable just building up that experience over the championship distance. But he finally got his world title shot in May of last year against the brilliant Manny Rodriguez. Now, again, some of you listening to this will disagree with me on this, but I think Manny Rodriguez is brilliant. I think he's very, very underrated. I've got a thing for Puerto Rican fighters, and I'll always show them a lot of respect, but I think Manny Rodriguez is one of those typical world-class Puerto Rican fighters whose base level is just world-class. And then if you get them on a good day, they're pushing towards being, a really top elite fighter. Never quite performed at that level, but on their best day, they're sort of pushing on towards that. But the very worst you're going to get from them is world class. And he proved that up until when he fought Inoue and got smoked. But again, Inoue at that point, it was Inoue. He was blasting for everyone at that point in time. Inoue didn't have the sort of chinks in the armor that you now see, where you look at Inoue and go, okay, he could get hit with a big left hand. There are these things you can now sort of pick out with Inoue. At that point in time, he was just this fella that was blasting through everyone. And at the time, Manny Rodriguez got smoked in that fight. And then following on from that, had some bad decisions go against him. He had a bit of bad luck as well, because he could have bounced back against Luis Neri, and I think he probably could have won that fight, but Neri blew the weight, so it fell through. He had some bad luck, but eventually picked up the IBF title again. And for me, I think he's just a really top fighter. And getting in against Nishida last year, whilst I rated Nishida and some of his early wins, I thought the lack of power might be a bit of an issue. I thought he might struggle to get Manny's respect. But what he did, and he led everyone, including Manny Rodriguez, down the garden path, and he sold us all a dream. For years, he was questioned about his lack of power, and it was obvious on his record because he only had the one KO. But it was questioned, on his record about this lack of power. And he said in numerous interviews throughout his early career, and he stated it time and time again, look, I'm there to hit and not get hit. I have power, but I don't really, sort of stand you in good stead to compete at the top level. I do think his power disadvantage, he's definitely the lesser of the two punchers in this fight. And if he can't get Junto's respect, he's going to have some problems. But just as a pure back foot boxer, I think he's technically the better of the two of them at just purely deciding, I'm going to win this fight over 12 rounds. I think it's going to be interesting. One thing, you look at his record, and you could say the same for Junto. Not a lot of southpaw experience. So that's going to be interesting to see how he deals with a very good southpaw. But the same goes for Junto. Junto doesn't have a great deal of southpaw experience either, especially against someone as technically good as Nishida. So don't write off Nishida heading into this fight. He's a fantastic fighter. And I genuinely think he's capable of doing the unthinkable in this fight. I really do think he's capable of producing something pretty special this upcoming weekend. Moving on to talk about the main man, Junto Nakatani, as I switch over to his slide on screen, you can see the notable wins jump out a hell of a lot more. He's just got more names on the resume. He's had triple the amount of pro fights. That's obviously going to stand out. And the amount of KOs in those 30 pro fights is pretty spectacular as well. You know, last year at bantamweight, had 3 fights and won all of them by knockout, none of them going past the 6th round. As he's got closer to the Inoue fight, it looks like Junto's just gone to a new level of confidence. He's developed physically. He's finding his power now. And I think the level of opposition's playing a factor in that. I think he just feels so comfortable against them. He's willing to really sit on his power punches. So I think against Nishida, it's going to be interesting because I think if he just goes looking for one shot, he'll struggle. And I think if you look at who Nakatani struggled with in his career, it's been short, come forward Mexicans that can really make it awkward for him. You look at the RG Cortez fight, you look at the Francisco Rodriguez fights, they were the most awkward fights for him in his career at the world level. And I think, you know, Nishida doesn't have that style. So I think it's going to be interesting to see how it sort of marries up. But just talking through that resume quickly, you might look at his best win there. And in my opinion, I think the best name on those notable wins is Masamichi Ibuki. Now, it's worth mentioning that at the point that Junto beat him, it was very early in his career when they were both prospects. It doesn't mean a great deal, but at that point, they were both prospects. So it was a good win at the time. It was a great fight as well if you want to go back and watch it. But that win has aged very well over time. You know, Masamichi Ibuki has gone on to become a 2-time light flyweight world champion, has gone up in weight and won a world title at flyweight. So he's a 2-time light flyweight world champion, a 2-weight world champion. Brilliant fighter, Ibuki. And to me, he stands out as his best win. But the point in time he beat him, it's not his best win, if that makes sense. Seigo Yuriaki is a similar story. You know, he fought Aki in the JBC youth tournament when he was a prospect, when they were both prospects, and he beat Aki. And at the time, again, good win, but that win now has aged so much better because Aki went from being a domestic fighter to then going on and winning a world title. And if you saw the Kenshiro Taraji fight, going in a unification and was fantastic in that fight, it was right at the end where it started to fall apart for him, and it did fall apart for him. So he's a brilliant fighter as well. If you look at those top 2 names, I think with time they've aged the best and maybe are the best wins, but the time that he beat them, not necessarily. Francisco Rodriguez, like I said, was Junto's toughest fight. It was a really difficult fight, but one that we predicted. I remember at the time doing a podcast about it and saying, I think this one goes the distance. I think Rodriguez is just a nightmare style for Junto because he can kind of get under those long arms. He can get close, he can work him, and he can counter and he can catch him. And Junto is there to be caught by the overhand right. And I thought that Rodriguez was going to be able to do that, which he did. Junto won it, but it was close and it was competitive. I think the rest of the names, again, Magramo, really good fighter, very underrated. Santiago, brilliant fighter, underrated. But no real signature wins. I just feel like, I think I said it earlier, but like if you go back and a Punch Perfect Boxing comes along in 15, 20 years, goes back and looks at Junto Nakatani's record, you know, say Junto retired tomorrow and 15, 20 years from now, young Punch Perfect Boxing comes along, who becomes obsessed with the sport at aged 8 or 9 and wants to go back and look at these great fighters, and he sees this fighter, 30-0 Junto Nakatani. I think if you looked for his resume, without speaking to people who were around at the time and really knew their stuff, apart from Ibuki, you'd probably, and Rodriguez as well, because of what he achieved in the lowest weight classes, you'd maybe go, okay, like any of those wins that particularly good? So I think he's got a lot of solid wins, but like I said earlier, I think Junto's issue now is that he's been brilliant. He's that pound for pound level talent, but it's just he hasn't dominated over a division yet, and he's got to do it. And I think there's a real eagerness from everyone now. And at first, I felt like it was Junto chasing Inoue, and Inoue wasn't really that interested. I feel like now there's kind of an acceptance from Team Inoue and everyone involved on both sides that Japanese super fight is the fight to make in the very near future. But I think if you're Junto, and I understand that's the money fight, that's the biggest acclaim. And listen, you're going to have a good chance of beating Inoue now because he's getting hurt and put down from those left hands, and Junto's got a monster left hand. So he can absolutely win that fight if it does happen in the next sort of 12 to 18 months. But I just look at that division, and if you think of Japanese undisputed champions, Inoue's been the one to do it, but there's been some damn good Japanese fighters over recent years, since fighting Arada, and they've not been able to do it. In this era, you look at Ken Shiro and Kazuto Ioka, who are wonderful fighters, but they've not been able to get over the line and win all the belts in the division. So I think Junto, if he beats Nishida, he'll be the Lineal and Ring Magazine champion at bantamweight. And that'll be following in the footsteps of Inoue. But then you've got Yoshiki Takai, who's another fellow countryman, very close with the Inoues. You've got Seiya Satsumi's now the champion in recess, and I think Vargas has been upgraded. Those fights are makeable. He could go undisputed there in the next 12 months and then get Inoue when maybe he's had a tough fight at super bantamweight against Akhmadliev. Maybe he's gone up to featherweight and fought a Nick Ball or an Espinoza and had a tough fight up there. I do think with Junto, there's the money side of it and the acclaim side of it and the belief side of it of make that super fight against Inoue. But I also think there's this window of opportunity now where if he beats Nishida, he could go on a run of Nishida, Takai, Vargas, whether Satsumi comes back and fights Vargas, whatever happens there. There's a window of opportunity for him now. But Junto's a wonderful fighter, an amazing fighter, and he goes into this fight as a favourite, and I'm not surprised because people simply know more about him. I've spoken about both fighters. I've spoken about why I love the fight so much and what it means and what's at stake. Now talking about how I think it will play out and who's going to be the victor on Sunday. I think when you get two southpaws, sometimes it can be a little bit standoffish and it can be a bit negative. I do think early on it's going to be quite tentative. I think Nishida is going to look to box long. I think Junto early on will probably look to do the same. And I think in the early rounds of the fight, although both of them are quite feisty, and when they want to let their shots go, they're very feisty, I do think there'll be an early portion of the fight where it is just a little bit tentative. Neither of them can really get their range. They're both just sort of trying to feel each other out. I think that favours Nishida more than it does Junto, because I think Nishida can box long quite just a bit more comfortable doing that. Nakatani wins fights by, being the puncher. He goes in there seeking the knockout. He in many ways, early on in his career, I used to compare him to Josh Taylor, where he was tall, lanky, southpaw, moved well, but he did his best work close up. You think a tall, lanky southpaw, they do their best work at range and almost have an amateur style. But much like Josh Taylor, it was getting to that mid to short range where he did his best work. As time's kind of gone on, I think Nakatani's become more comfortable as he's developed physically to catch you on the back foot like he did against Maloney. And I think he's able to counter now off the back foot with that left hand. I think he might struggle early on with that because I think Nishida won't take many risks. I think my concern for Nishida is I think his best work up close is to the body, and to land to the body, you've got to get up close to do it. And getting up close to Junto means you're going to have to take a risk where you're entering that kind of danger zone between yourself and Junto. And on that little journey, trying to get into the inside to land those body shots, Junto's going to look to land a big overhand left. And I think what's so special about Junto is it's not the same shot. I think when you look at power punchers like a Deontay Wilder, for example, that overhand right can often look the same and can become predictable. I think with Junto, he can throw that left hand in so many different ways. You think of the knockout against Maloney where he walked him onto it and he sort of has his fist almost to the side and captures him like that. But you look at against Santiago where he throws a perfect textbook straight left. It's as straight as an arrow and he puts him down. That he's got every sort of variation of that backhand in his locker. And I think Nishida's going to have a bit of a hard time as the fight progresses, trying to figure out how he can land stuff that's significant. Because in the early rounds, like I say, when it's going to be tentative and it's a bit of a standoff, I think that favours Nishida because I think he's more comfortable doing that and he doesn't get as edgy. Junto tends to get a bit frustrated if it becomes a bit boring and it's a bit like, I want to knock him out. He becomes a little bit like Boots Ennis almost, where Boots Ennis can box you. He's got the skills, the athleticism, the reach and the height to do it. But it's like, I don't want to do this. I want to take the fight to my opponent. I want to knock them out. And I think Junto is very much similar where Nishida will be comfortable just boxing for 12 rounds, but it will get to the stage in the fight where Junto starts to read that and has to take some risks. And I think Nishida just won't have the answer to stop him progressing. Nishida's best work is to the body, and I think he can hurt Junto there. But how do you consistently land to the body without getting close to Junto and taking a risk? And it's just one risk too many I think he's eventually going to take. I think the fight, and again, I think this is a much higher level fight. I don't think stylistically it's necessarily the same. But if you think back to the tragic fight between Seiya Satsumi and Anaguchi, where Anaguchi obviously sadly lost his life. If you think about that fight where Anaguchi was boxing the ears off Satsumi at times, but then was just getting caught with one shot and then getting put down, and it was just like he was taking damage in small doses and it was accumulating over the rounds, even though he was winning rounds at times and making it look easy. I think to a different level in this fight, Nishida early on is going to be the beneficiary of it being quite a tentative affair. But as it progresses, he's not going to be able to stop Junto from progressing. And when he starts to have to take some risks of his own, things become more dangerous for him and he starts getting clipped. I think this is a wonderful fight. I think this is the toughest test of both of their careers by some distance. Like I said, not a lot of southpaw experience between the pair of them. So I think those early rounds will be each of them just kind of figuring things out a little bit. I think it'll be quite tentative. And I think Junto will be fearful of Nishida's power like Nishida will of Junto. But I think Junto will be aware that Nishida's quick and he's able to get off the mark really quick. And he is a very good boxer that can pick you off. So I think the early rounds will be very tentative. They'll be a bit standoffish and trying to figure out the southpaw stance of each other. They're both long, both tall. And I think Nishida will benefit from that just because his style is a bit more sort of conducive to boxing first rather than trying to be the aggressor and landing a big shot. And sort of around the halfway stage, I think the signs will be there that Nishida has probably just by default won the early rounds. But as we're progressing into the middle stages, Junto has had a moment or landed a punch that has just started to turn things, and Nishida then starting to having to hold his feet. It gets a bit like the Manny Rodriguez fight where he's having to dig in on the inside. But unlike Manny Rodriguez, Junto is going to have that punch and that power and that spite and the want to get him out of there. And I think as we progress into the championship rounds, I think Nishida just might start running a little bit low. I think taking one big shot every round for a couple of rounds will start to take effect. And as we get into sort of rounds 9, 10, 11, I think Junto's just going to really turn it up a bit. I think he's going to get more accurate. I think Nishida's going to have to hold his feet. And I think Junto is going to be more comfortable being the aggressor and the puncher in the situation. I think Nishida early on, like I say, will be awkward. I think he'll land some good work to the body. And I think Junto maybe even gets hurt to the body. But as we progress later into the fight, I think the guy whose power really carries in Junto, and we saw against Manny Rodriguez, when it does start to get tough, Nishida does have to hold his feet and engage. I think that Junto might just close the gap and he'll find the shot and the damage will start to take over. And I think Junto's probably going to prevail in the championship rounds or do enough where Nishida hands-on takes an awful lot of damage. I mean, we've seen some fights recently with Japanese fighters in Masanori Rikishi against Sugar Nunes, Jinjiro Shigioka, who I give my best to, and his team and his family, against Pedro Tadaran in their rematch. They managed to go the distance when it looks like they shouldn't because they're unbelievably tough and unbelievably fit, but they take a lot of damage in there. And I think Nishida, it could be, he loses narrowly on points, but he takes a lot of damage, and you kind of look at them afterwards and think it's probably more one-sided just by looking at the pair of them. But I think Junto in the late stages has that power to just make it count. So I'm going to go for Junto Nakatani to win. I think either stoppage in rounds 10 to 12 or a points decision that's a competitive fight, but one where he just gets the better of it in the second half of the contest. Let me know your thoughts down below, guys. Let me know if there are any other fights coming up that you would like me to discuss. I'm definitely willing to do so. Thank you for tuning in. Really appreciate all of you. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. A link to my Patreon is in the description where we do the betting as well. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll catch you next time. Peace.